Welcome to Believing the Word with author and pastor Dan Shunk. This program is a ministry of Calvary Chapel Chambersburg in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Here's what's coming up in today's message.
So all of those that are offended, that are repulsed by this idolatry, those are the true believers, right? Didn't we say that earlier? That a Christian, we still get tempted. Christians still fall into sin. But when we do it, we're like, oh man, why? Come on, what are you doing? Straighten up. And we hate it. That's one of the marks. And so this is exactly what God says. Go to them. Go to the ones that have that regenerated heart, that hate sin, and mark them.
Is idolatry just an ancient problem? Gold statues and pagan temples? Or is it something far closer to home? In Ezekiel 8-9, God pulls back the curtain and shows us what he sees, not just on the outside, but in the hidden places. Secret sins, subtle compromises, hearts divided while lips still claim devotion. And what we discover is unsettling. Idolatry isn't just misplaced worship, it's a deep betrayal of God's holiness. These chapters confront us with a sobering truth. What we tolerate, God takes seriously. So the question isn't just, what is idolatry, but how bad is it really? And even more, could it be closer to us than we think? Now here's Pastor Dan in the book of Ezekiel as he continues his message, Idolatry's Evil. How bad is it?
So step one is that we're just showing this respect for other idols. We just sort of allow it around us. And now here, beginning in verse 9, here's step 2 is it gets worse with our own idolatry. We begin to practice secretly. Oh, you're not proud of it. You're not out there showing everybody your idols and your false worship, but you're doing it in secret. And that's exactly what Ezekiel sees next, beginning in verse 9. Take a look at this. He said to me, this is God who said that to him. God is his tour guide. He said to me, go in and see the evil abominations that they are doing. So I entered and I looked, and behold, every form of creeping thing and beasts and detestable things with all the idols of the house of Israel were carved on the wall all around. This is in the temple court. In verse 11, standing in front of them were 70 elders of the house of Israel, with Jezaniah, the son of Shaphan, standing among them, every man with his censer in his hand and his fragrance of a cloud of incense rising. And in verse 12, then he said to me, Son of man, do you see what the elders of the house of Israel are doing in the dark? In the dark, notice that. Each man in the room of his carved images. For they say, Yahweh does not see us. Yahweh has forsaken the land. Now, first of all, they're in the temple. We know this. Who are they? These are it says they're the 70 elders. They name one of them here, Jezaniah. These 70 elders is actually the beginning of the Jewish Sanhedrin. We read in the New Testament about the Sanhedrin that's run by the high priest. This is the very beginnings of it. Remember, up until this time, up until the Babylonian captivity, Israel was run by what? By the kings. By David and his descendants, right through the kings. But what happened at the second Babylonian captivity? Babylon replaced the kingship and they put a governor in there. The kingship of David and that lineage is done. And so as that puppet governor appointed by Babylon came in here 6 years ago, this group of 70 Jewish leaders began to stand up and began to take the power structure. And so this is the very beginnings of what's called the Jewish Sanhedrin that we read all about in the New Testament. And so this is the 70. We see in here these signs of, first of all, we saw signs of this public allowance of sin at the gate. And now we go inside and we notice that there is greater sins on the inside. I think that's very fascinating that very, very often, if you see signs of allowance of sin on the outside, that means there's much greater sin happening in the dark, in secret, behind closed doors, right? I find that if you find somebody allowing something publicly or speaking something publicly, there's probably something deeper going on in secret that they're not admitting. And we see that. Here's these elders that are running the temple who have this idol up at the gate out front, and inside, what are they doing? They're worshiping all kinds of idols on the inside. All of this issue of frankincense and the fragrance, this is all offering their prayers to these idols. How do you get to this point? How do you get to this point where you stop worshiping the Creator and you begin worshiping the creation? Well, I think there's actually an indication right in the verse of how this happened. Did you see that there in verse 12? God asked Ezekiel in verse 12, he says, what are they doing in the dark? And then he answers the question at the end of verse 12. And he said, they're doing this because they said in their hearts, Yahweh does not see us. Yahweh has forsaken the land. If you live in such a way that you do not believe that God is involved in your life or God is real at all, then that will allow you to do anything you want. You're on your own. And they began to live on their own. They thought that God doesn't care about them. They thought that God was not involved. That we've said this a few times recently, that this is a life of practical atheism. They're living as if there is no God. And the scripture calls that being a fool, to live as if there's no God. They mistook the gift of free will and of God's hands-off approach. They mistook that for God not caring. That's not the case. When God gives you free will and says, I'm going to let you choose the path you take, don't mistake that for God not caring about what you do. Of course he cares. He wants you to make the right decisions. He wants you to make healthy decisions that's going to help you, that's going to benefit you, that's going to benefit others. But he's a gentleman. He's not going to come in and violate your free will, right? He's given us free will. Don't mistake God's standoff approach by saying he doesn't care. Not true. And he says that over and over to them. And so they're doing all of these detestable things in secret, in private. They're not admitting it. But we see it goes deeper and it goes further. And this is a progression of how idolatry begins to affect our hearts. We go to verse 13 now, and it actually goes deeper. This takes us to step 3 in verse 13. Do we go to such an extent that this idol worship begins to happen from the heart? From the heart. In verse 13 and 14, we see that it's actually now idolatry's gotten to the point where it's now infiltrated their very hearts. Look at verse 13. He said to me, yet you will see still greater abominations which they are doing. And so in verse 14, he brought me to the entrance of the gate of the house of Yahweh, which is towards the north. And behold, women were sitting there weeping for Tammuz. And now that's it. That's the only verse you get on this point. But we can understand what this is just from secular literature. We know what this is all about. Tammuz was the male god, false god, who had his, false goddess wife Ishtar, where we get Easter from. And we could go through that whole thing right now describing Easter. But Tammuz was the false god of the harvest cycle. And so they mourned Tammuz every fall, and then they celebrated Tammuz every spring in coincidence with the harvest cycle. And so they utilized that to represent death and resurrection. And they called it Tammuz as the one that died and resurrected every year, died and resurrected, died and resurrected. By the way, they didn't, some people have this foolish idea that, Christianity stole the idea of resurrection from the false god Tammuz. Christianity is just a mockery of all these other false religions that came earlier than Christianity. That is so silly. Death and resurrection is painted all over God's creation. He put it right in creation. The sun goes down every day, and then guess what? It resurrects every morning. It's everywhere. This idea of the cycle of death and resurrection is everywhere in creation. So don't fall for this whole, Christianity stole it from some pagan religion and Christianity's fake. It was stolen from God's creation in the original first place. And so now this is interesting when we read in verse 14 that the women are here weeping for Tammuz. So this shows both that they are connected to the false gods and that there's disorder in God's created order, because there shouldn't be women in the temple at all. This part of the temple was not designed for women. It was designed for the men, and then the priests in the inner part of that. So only male priests should have been in this part of the court. And so, they're weeping because this is the fall part of the feast where they're weeping the death of Tammuz, the end of the year, before the resurrection comes in the spring. And so it shows their heart is connected. Their heart is connected to this false worship. It's not just something that we also have this statue. No, they're connected. They're worshiping. They're into this. Now we know. I mean, the Lord keeps saying step by step, I'm going to show you something still greater that's even worse. So our last step was them worshiping in secret. What's worse than worshiping in secret? What they're doing right here. They're worshiping from the heart. That's worse. It's worse. It's a part of them. It's what they want. They're into it now. This is what I want to do. It's not just something I allow. It's not just something that's around me. No, this is what I want. I believe it's going to be helpful to me. It's infiltrated them to that level. And this is wrong. This is wrong. It's corrupted them not just in a social way, but it's corrupted them in their heart. What's so wrong about this is that a believer may fall for a temptation, a believer may fall for a sin, but we despise it, right? When you fall for a temptation or you fall into a sin, it doesn't take long for a believer to be like, man, why did I do that? Right? You despise it. You hate it. But here's people that love it. They love it. They're into this idol worship and they want it. And they love it. But guess what? It gets worse. There's one step worse. It describes it here in verse 15 going forward. It's not just now that it's not just that it's something that they allow around them. It's not just something that they're doing in secret. It's not just something they're doing from the heart. But now we get to verse 15 and it gets worse. Now it's something that they're actually spreading to others. They're actually spreading their idolatry. They're so proud of it. We want you to do it. Look at verse 15. He said to me, do you see this, son of man? Yet you will see still greater abominations than these. Then in verse 16, he brought me into the inner court of the house of Yahweh. And behold, at the entrance to the temple of Yahweh, between the porch and the altar, were about 25 men with their backs to the temple of Yahweh. And their faces were towards the east. They're facing what matters to them, and it's not the temple. Their faces towards the east, and they were prostrating themselves eastward towards the sun. That's what they're doing. They're worshiping the creation. They're worshiping the heavenly bodies. It's still done today. It's called astrology and every other form of zodiac worship. So what's he saying here? What's worse than what could be worse is ascribing God's creative power and glory to something that he created, right? I mean, can you imagine going up to Henry Ford in the early days of Ford and getting in that car, driving that brand new Ford around, Model T or something, and all you're used to is a horse and buggy, and you get out of the Model T and Henry Ford says to you, so what'd you think? And you ignore him and you look at the car and you're like, man, car, you are awesome, car. Car, I can't believe how great you are. And Henry Ford's like, that's a hunk of metal. I made that, right? What are you doing? Talk to me, not the car. It's the same foolishness when you see somebody worshiping the creation rather than the creator. God is like, why are you acting like they're something special? I gave it its power, right? What was the light before the sun came into existence? God was the light, right? Go back and reread the days of creation or when God made the sun. And there was plenty of light before the sun came around. Its name was God. Okay? He gave the sun its glory and its brilliance. And here they are worshiping the creation rather than worshiping God. And what are they doing? They're doing it in public. They're right out there doing it in front of each other and in the public so everybody else can see what's happening. Verse 17, let's go 2 more verses. He said to me, do you see this, son of man? Is it too light a thing for the house of Judah to do the abominations which they have done here? That they have filled the land with violence and provoked me to anger still more. They filled the land. They're spreading this idolatry. Continuing verse 17, for behold, they're sending forth the twig to their nose. That's actually a very obscure phrase. We don't know what it means, but you know the interpretation of it. It means that it's offensive to God. And in verse 18, therefore I will do this in wrath. My eye will have no pity, nor will I spare, and they will cry in my ears with a loud voice, yet I will not listen to them. So they not only are doing these things, but they have spread this idolatry throughout the land. That is the stages and the steps and the progression of all of this and just how bad it can get. Listen to what Paul said in Romans chapter 1. I just want to give you this one verse here at the end of chapter 1 of Romans. But Paul said, not only do these sinners that he's talking about that are worshiping the creation, not only although they know the righteous requirement of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, they not only do these things, but also they give hearty approval to those who practice them. They love to spread this. They love to pass it around. They want others doing it, not just themselves. This is no longer some private thing that they're doing. And so all of this progression of idolatry, I think it's a real challenge in chapter 8. It's a real challenge to say, don't even let the first step of this invade our hearts. Don't even come up with excuses why we would allow idolatry to be around us. And I tell you, we can come up with all kinds of them. Well, it's just something that other person is doing, and they just happen to be in my house under my authority. What? If they're in your house under your authority, then don't allow it, right? Now, chapter 9, I really believe goes with this here. It's a short little chapter, but it really plays on the very last verse of chapter 8 where God says, I'm going to judge them for this, and I will not have pity or hold back. And so finally here in chapter 9, judgment begins to fall. But what we find is something very, very fascinating that God does all the time. He did it from the time of Noah and the ark, and he's going to do it right up and through the tribulation, where God knows how to spare the believers. When judgment is going to fall, God knows how to mark the believers and take them out. Many of you may know this, how even in the tribulation time, the believers are marked in the tribulation so that judgment does not fall on them. And that's exactly what's going to happen here. God says to Ezekiel that I'm going to have judgment fall on Judah, but before judgment falls, God marks the righteous. And that's what we see. This is a precursor. This is a template or a picture, a prototype of what God will do in the tribulation to come. We won't be here, Lord willing. If you're a believer, you're not going to be here for this. You won't have to be marked and protected. Chapter 9, let's begin in verse 1. Then he cried out in my hearing with a loud voice, saying, draw near, O executioners of the city, each with his destroying weapon in his hand. And behold, in verse 2, 6 men, these are angels, we'll get into that in just a second. Behold, 6 men were coming from the direction of the upper gate, which faces north. That's the gate that had that idol that we talked about, the image of jealousy. They were coming from that north gate, each with his shattering weapon in his hand. And among them was a certain man clothed, and again an angel, a certain man clothed in linen with a scribe's case in his loins or attached to his hip. And they went in and they stood beside the bronze altar. And so God calls for executioners, and here comes these 7 angels to do this judgment. Angels are often called men in the scripture. You see, because of their appearance. If they look like a man, then people often call them men. You can read similar accounts in the 4 Gospels, in which 2 of the Gospels will say, and then 2 angels appeared to me. And the other Gospel of the same account will say 2 men in shining apparel, because they look like men is the idea. And so the same thing here. These are 6 angels that have weapons of war in their hand, and then another one that's got a scribe's tool. He's got a writing pad and an inkhorn in his hand. And so interesting here that often angels have geographic duties. These angels are sent specifically to judge Jerusalem. And so this is the behind the scenes. We know that it's Babylon that's going to come in and wipe out Jerusalem. But this is the heavenly picture of what's really happening. I believe that these angels are the angels that are in charge of Jerusalem proper as a city. And the 7th one, of course, here is a heavenly writer, a heavenly scribe, you could say. We see geographic angels all through the scripture, particularly in Daniel chapter 10. The angel comes to speak to Daniel, and he says that I was in a battle with the angel of the prince of Persia. And then Michael, your prince, came and helped me. And so we hear about angels that fallen angels or God's angels that have geographic responsibilities on this earth. And I believe these are some of the same. And so here comes these 6 destroyers, but then one to right things. Let's take a look at verse 3, what happens. Then the glory of the God of Israel went up from the cherub on which it had been. I want to explain that before we even read. You're like, what cherub? We haven't read about a cherub here. Well, where has the glory of God been? We said that the glory of God was in the tabernacle, and then it was in the temple. Well, where was it in the temple? It's in the Holy of Holies. And what does the Holy of Holies have? The Ark of the Covenant. And if you remember the Ark of the Covenant, on the top of it, it had the mercy seat that had the cherubim, the angels, on the top of that looking at each other. That's where the presence of God, the glory of God was. And so when you read this here in verse 3, when it says the glory of the God of Israel went up from the cherub, that's what it's talking about. It's going to begin to leave the temple there in Jerusalem, on which it had been, and it removed where? To the threshold of the house of the Lord. And he called to the man clothed in linen, at which loins was the scribe's case. So the God himself, the glory of God, is going to call out first to the scribe, the heavenly scribe, not to the destroyers, but first he calls out to this heavenly scribe. And what does he do in verse 4? In verse 4, Yahweh said to him, go through the midst of the city, even through the midst of Jerusalem, and put a mark. I'm going to ask you if you have a different translation of that word mark in just a second. Go forth the midst of Jerusalem and put a mark on the foreheads of the men who sigh and groan over all the abominations which are being done in the midst of Jerusalem. So what is this? God tells the angel with the inkhorn to put a mark on the believers. Does anybody have a translation other than mark, or does everybody just have mark? Okay, this is in the Hebrew, this is tav. This is tav. There is always this principle where God marks or protects his own before judgment falls. Think of the Passover, right? When Israel and Moses were leaving Egypt, he marked the houses as a whole family and said, okay, these ones are protected. The same thing. There's a supernatural protection and God's favor on those whose hearts are obeying him. Isn't that exactly who he called out at the end of verse 4? Who are these people that are getting marked? Put a mark on the forehead, it says, of the men who sigh and groan over the abominations which are being done. So all of those that are offended, that are repulsed by this idolatry, those are the true believers, right? Didn't we say that earlier? That a Christian, we still get tempted. Christians still fall into sin. But when we do it, we're like, oh, man, why? Come on, what are you doing? Straighten up. And we hate it. That's one of the marks. And so this is exactly what God says. Go to them. Go to the ones that have that regenerated heart, that hate sin, and mark them. And you will see that is a mark for protection, just like it was during the Passover in the days of old. And we see it again in the 7-year tribulation in the future. We see that during that time, after the church is raptured and the 7-year tribulation begins, God will go through and he will protect 144,000 Jews during that time. And remember, the 7-year tribulation is not for the church. We're gone.
You've been listening to Believing the Word, a ministry of author and pastor Dan Shunk at Calvary Chapel Chambersburg in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Pastor Dan has been teaching through a series in the book of Ezekiel. We'd love to get connected with you and hear about how God is working in your life through this teaching program. You can reach us by phone at 717-500-1102. Again, that number is 717-500-1102. You can also check us out at our website at ccchambersburg.org, where you can learn more about the ministry of Calvary Chapel Chambersburg and find our chapter-by-chapter messages. If you're in the Chambersburg area, we'd love to have you join us Sunday mornings and Thursday evenings on 5121 Coffee Avenue. Thank you for joining us today. We'll be back with more from the book of Ezekiel. But until then, this has been Believing the Word with Pastor Dan Shunk.